Happy Thursday morning. Welcome to reading. All right. What we need for our ELA reading class today is your copy of I Survived the American Revolution 1776. Open to chapter 7. And you also need your chapter 7 questions. All right, so to recap where we left off, when we read chapters 5 and 6 yesterday, let me scroll back through our chapter 5 and 6. So, Nate had hurt his Uncle Storch, so he had to run away. He hops a boat and he sails from Connecticut to New York. And he thinks when he gets to New York, this is going to be great. He's going to do all the things that his father taught him how to do on a boat. And he's going to have this wonderful life at sea, just like pirates do. Pirates/O'Shea. Off he goes, and he's quite happy with himself. He talks about how he was out with his father, and when they were in New York, it was the most wonderful place he'd been. And they talk about puppet shows and jugglers on the streets, eating with forks. That was so exciting back then. And he gets to the island of Manhattan, and things seem a little strange. He starts to see a lot of soldiers, that there's these blockades, these dirt walls built up in the streets, that some of the streets are deserted, that he realizes there's a lot of American soldiers in their plain clothes. And then he realizes that the conversation that his uncle and his friend were having the other day was about New York being in the way of the next big battle. Nate thought they were talking about Boston, so now he realizes that he's in a little bit of trouble. He might be stuck here in Manhattan, knowing that the King of England has sent hundreds of ships towards them and that a big battle is coming any day. If I was Nate, I'd start to panic a little bit. Let's see what happens and what he does. Chapter 7, 3:15 p.m. Nate charged back to the waterfront. His best hope was to catch the Valerie back to Connecticut. Okay, so he's thinking if he runs back to the dock, he can just hopefully sneak onto or get onto the same boat that he was just on, because he knows that boat is going back to Connecticut. And maybe he just wants to get home and he can figure out something from there. He'd figure out what to do when he got there. If he couldn't sneak onto the Valerie like last time, he'd beg the captain to take him. He'd offer to scrub the decks, carry out the dead rats, anything. But Nate was too late. He reached the dock just as the Valerie was sailing away. He tore down the dock yelling, "Stop! Wait! Come back!" But the soldiers couldn't hear him. And even if they could, Nate knew the captain wouldn't turn the ship around for some nobody kid. Now what would Nate do? He stared out into the harbor, as though the answer might be floating in the water. And that's when he spotted them. Two enormous sailing ships. They were coming from the south and seemed to be headed right for the city. Nate's heart lifted up. Maybe he could find a job after all. But as the ships came closer, he realized they were not regular sailing ships like Papa's. They were bigger. They rose proudly out of the water, each with 12 sparkling white sails gleaming in the sun. As they turned slightly, Nate saw that both ships had small, square openings along the sides, and poking out of each square was the black muzzle of a cannon. They were like giant black serpents peering out from their caves. Flags of England flap from the ship's mast. They were British warships. The mast on a sailboat is that long, high sail. Hold on, let me get you a picture. Okay, so the ship that Nate would see would look something like this. This tall, big pillar here, this is the mast. This is where their sails are. Here's the British flag. Here is the wooden ship, and if you look really carefully, let me get my writing tool here. If you look real careful, you can see here are the cannons sticking out from the ship. There's another good picture. You could take a look at this one. This is an American ship, but the same idea. Tall masts with big sails and cannons sticking out of the side. So let's come back to our book. Nate thought that these ships that he saw coming were American ships, but now he's realizing that they're British warships, like the picture I just showed you. Nate stared with a mix of fear and fascination, like the time he found a scorpion in his hammock. All his life he'd been hearing stories about the British Navy. It was the mightiest on earth, with hundreds of warships prowling the seas. The greatest British warship of them all were called men of war, floating cities that could hold 1,000 men and almost 100 big cannons. Each cannon would blast a 24-pound ball that would streak through the air faster than a person could blink. There was no weapon on earth as powerful as a big cannon. Gosh, can you imagine a 24-pound giant ball of metal flying through the air? Imagine how much destruction that could cause. Nate knew it took 5 men to load and fire each one. One ball could punch through a stone fortress wall. It could rip through a line of soldiers. It could turn a house to rubble. It could blow a hole in an enemy warship, dooming it to an underwater grave. But the crew of a big warship didn't just fire off one cannonball at a time. They fired dozens of cannons all at once, unleashing a crushing wave of metal balls. A man of war could destroy a city within hours. Nate's blood turned cold as he watched the 2 warships stream around the southern tip of the city. A crowd of American soldiers had joined Nate on the dock. They shouted out curses and shook their fists. And then a thundering explosion shook the ground. Kaboom! The explosion rattled Nate's bones and almost sent him leaping into the water in fear. But then he realized that the blast hadn't come from either of the British ships. Across the river, in Brooklyn, big puffs of gray smoke rose up from the hilltop. When the curtain of smoke cleared, Nate could see 10 cannons lined up in a row, Kaboom! 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 They blasted away at the British ships. And then came blasts from somewhere closer, on this side of the river. The Americans must have put cannons all around the city. Soldiers were crowding the docks now. Two men stood behind Nate. They screamed out insults to the British ships. "Putting on a little show for us, you devils," one jeered. "We'll blast you up to the moon." The American cannons thundered and boomed. The air was filled with sharp, metal stink of gunpowder smoke. Soldiers whooped and cheered after every blast. Kaboom! Huzzah! Kaboom! Huzzah! None of the American cannonballs hit the ships. Each splashed down harmlessly in the river. But the soldiers didn't seem to care. They roared and taunted. "Sink those cowards!" But then Nate noticed that the bigger of the British warships had slowed down. A tongue of flame flicked out of one of its cannons. Kaboom! An odd, sizzling sound filled the sky overhead. Someone screamed, and then crash! A cannonball came down, smashing a house just a few yards away from where Nate stood. The ground shook. Shards of wood rained down. A man shouted out, "Run!" Uh-oh. Sounds like Nate is in a lot of trouble. Sounds like we're right back to where we began in Chapter 1. Because remember, Chapter 1 started with him on the battlefield in Brooklyn. So now what you're going to do is open up your Chapter 7 comprehension questions. And you're going to answer them. How did Nate react when he realized he had landed in the war? What did Nate see coming in the harbor? How did the American soldiers react to the incoming ships? How did the British respond to the attack? And what does Nate know about the British Navy? I'm looking for well thought out and written fourth grade sentences. I'd like you to restate your answer and to find evidence from the text. I want strong sentences, not 1 or 2 or 3 word answers. And if you really want to challenge yourself, try your best with your punctuation. Remember that sentences begin with a capital letter and end with either a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point. Remember that proper nouns get a capital letter. Somebody's name, like Nate. American, British. Do your best. Answer these 5 questions. Take a picture or send this document back to me for classwork and house points. See you guys tonight on Zoom. Bye.